Hello, thank you so much for joining us today with the Start Simple with Accessibility session. I'm Jen Smith. I'm an accessibility program manager and subject matter expert for Microsoft. And I'm joined today by my accessibility expert friends, Natalie, Patrice Tucker from Spotify and Lori Samuels from NBC Universal. As a quick introduction, my pronouns are she, her. I'm a white, middle-aged woman, long, brownish, grayish hair, more grayish than I'd like at this point. It's straight. I have glasses with dark frames, an oval face, and rosy cheeks. Today, I'm wearing a black shirt and a purple-ish scarf. I'm sitting in my home office with white walls behind me and some light wooden doors in the background. Natalie and Lori, would you want to go ahead and introduce yourselves?
Absolutely. My name is Natalie Patrice Tucker, and I am a Black woman with locks below my shoulders, salt and pepper gray locks, and I am sitting in a berry-colored room wearing a gray sweater dress.
Thanks. And I'm Lori Samuels. I'm also a middle-aged white woman with blonde hair and glasses and a pink sweater sitting in my kind of gray-themed home office with a picture of the Oakland Bay Bridge behind me.
Thank you, ladies. So our mission today is really to give you simple, practical steps to begin your accessibility journey. There's a lot of misconceptions about accessibility out there. It's too hard, it's too complex. But we're here today to let you know you can really start without a whole bunch of specialized knowledge. You don't need a lot of skill sets. There's really simple, learnable techniques that are easy to incorporate and scale across your development lifecycle. So as we start on this journey, I want you to consider us your guides. We've been through this and we're here to help demystify some of this for you. So our agenda today, we're going to cover what to expect. We're going to clarify common points of confusion, outline high-level processes, give you some tips to scope your work. We're also going to give you simple steps to test for accessibility, highlight how to prioritize, fix, and verify. Then we'll wrap it up with some common pitfalls. So as we guide you through understanding the most common and preventable digital accessibility barriers, our aim is to teach you learnable, scalable techniques and questions you can ask yourself in the design, build, and testing process of your site. So quick housekeeping point, as a reminder, if you have questions, just ask them throughout the whole session. Natalie, Lori, and I are in the chat, and we'll answer the questions as we go. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Lori.
Thanks, Jen. So we thought about calling this slide All the Feels because there actually is an emotional aspect to accessibility work, and we want to prepare you for that as well. So there's a saying, and I think I'll credit Jenny Leigh Fleury for this, that if you don't know if your website is accessible, it's not. So the first thing that happens when you begin testing to try and identify accessibility issues is that you'll find them, lots of them. And you'll realize that this very cool product that you love and you've been working on for a while doesn't actually work for people with disabilities. And you'll feel badly about that. And then you'll begin to get a little or possibly a lot overwhelmed and might not even know where to start. So that's why we're doing this presentation. So trust me, we've definitely all been there. And the good news is that with some patience and some practice, things will get better. And eventually, you might just start to feel like you know what you're doing and even kind of like this accessibility thing. So we also want to address that overwhelm and confusion right away. So the four most common areas where people get confused or don't quite know what the first steps are the following. So how do we test an audit or get an assessment? What does that look like? How do we prioritize once we know that there are some accessibility problems that we need to fix? And then how do we fix them? And how do we know that we actually fixed the problems? So those are all common points of confusion. So this high-level view of a typical life cycle, it applies to an existing product. If you're starting a brand new product from scratch, then absolutely please, incorporate accessibility requirements and inclusive design principles. That's a fantastic way to do things. But more often than not, we're starting from something that already exists and is out there in the universe. The steps really are outlined here as the first thing is to pick a scope to actually evaluate or test. And we'll talk about in the next slide why that we want that to be a kind of small scope. And then do the test. We're going to help you in this presentation with several simple steps that you can just follow this prescription for and identify issues. And then it's a question of how to prioritize those issues, fix them, and verify them like we talked about. So let's go ahead and dive in. So the first thing is, how do we scope? How much should we be doing? Should we just test the entire 1,000-page website? Well, maybe not. So when I was starting out in accessibility eons ago, I read a book called Switch by a gentleman named Chip and Dan Heath. They're brothers. And it was a book about how to change when change is hard. And accessibility change can be hard. So I took several lessons from that book, and one of them was to shrink the change, meaning start small to reduce the overwhelm of learning new skills. So when you approach your project to improve accessibility, start with a small scope. Pick a representative sample of your user experience. Think about how people use your site or your app, and pick just a few core user flows, maybe 1, 2, or 3, to start that accessibility testing on. So now we're going to dive into accessibility testing, and Natalie is going to lead us through that.
Thanks, Lori. So in this conversation, we'll be really looking at just a few fundamental steps that can serve you, sort of like the bedrock of your initial accessibility testing plan. And mind you, there are lots of ways that you can approach this. But we feel like these 4 essential steps will set you up best for success now, while you're at the beginning of your accessibility journey, and continually actually serve you as you expand your testing program. So we're going to be looking at ensuring semantic code. Next, we're going to be ensuring keyboard navigation. And we're going to investigate usability for folks with low vision by checking high contrast mode and screen magnification. And then we're going to talk and finally look at using the Accessibility Insights tool to find and fix low-hanging fruit. Let's start by talking about the importance of validating the rendered code for your product or website. Validating your code using a markup validator or linter, or one of the tools available in the browser like Lighthouse, improves the usability and functionality, because your users won't run into issues in the browser and other rendering agents based on your code. It's also sure to improve performance and cross-browser compatibility for your products. So there are lots and lots of tools abound that will perform this service. You can use the W3C's markup validation tool, which we've linked later in the resources. You can use a linter specific to your build system. For example, HTML validation module in NPM, in the NPM repo. Also, Lighthouse, for example, dev tool in Chrome will flag HTML validation conflicts because of their impact on performance. Excellent. Well, when you're doing that, you want to, it's good to have an understanding of how your rendered code impacts the accessibility of your product. On the screen, you will see an illustration that we borrowed from the spec, the proposed spec for the accessibility object model, around how that works. And what happens is that when a web page gets displayed in the browser, gets rendered in the browser, everything comes together. We're talking about backend data, CSS styles, JavaScript, to create what's called the document object model, with nodes for every element that's on that page. From the document object model, another data structure is created called the accessibility tree that the native API on the operating system uses to communicate to the assistive technology. The assistive technology takes that information from the accessibility API, the accessibility tree, and communicates that to the user, and also takes the user's inputs and translates that such that the DOM can be interacted with. So assistive technologies like screen readers, for example, which we'll talk about a little bit later, braille readers, switch devices even. And those are the kinds of tools that use the accessibility API to gather information. It's really important that you understand the impact of keyboard navigation on your site. Folks who can't use a mouse, don't have fine motor acuity, will use the keyboard to navigate. And so it's important that you understand the best practices for how that should work. Essentially, you'll want to start from the top and tab through to ensure that every single interactive element on the page can be interacted with via the keyboard. That it's clear where the focus is, generally using a visible focus indicator around each tabbable or interactive element. You also want to make sure that there's no content that is only available via mouse hover or click actions with the mouse. You want to ensure that you can not only move focus to, but away from interactive elements so that there's no keyboard trapping, and that the order of the interactive elements makes sense and aligns with how it would be read visually.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Like, all of that is really essential to understand how it all comes together in the back end to understand how it impacts your customer. So in this next step, I'm going to demo one of my most favorite tools of all time. It's Accessibility Insights. And I don't say that because it's a Microsoft open source product. I truly do love it. The automated tests in the tool can help you find about 20 or 30% of the accessibility issues. If you use then the ad hoc and assessment tools in there, you can again look under the hood without reviewing the actual code, get test steps to walk through the manual testing for the WCAG criteria. I promise if I'd had this at the beginning of my accessibility journey, it would have helped me immensely to deeply understand the issues I was trying to solve, how it impacts my customers. So Accessibility Insights is there. It provides a browser plugin, a Windows desktop tool, and there's a new Android app testing tool available. So with that, I'm going to do a quick demo of the site to show you how it works. I'm going to demo a site to show you how it works. We've got Accessibility University here. It's a demo site. It was built to be inaccessible. There's an inaccessible version and an after version that is accessible. So I've pulled up Accessibility Insights. It's a plugin in my browser. You can expand it, and I've already done the automated checks here, but there's other ways to see this content. So when Accessibility Insights finds an error, what it does is it puts a boundary box around the issue and an icon. So you can select the icon. You can then see a pop-up that shows you what the problem is, the success criterion that it fails. Then you can understand the rule name, and then you can select the rule name to get some information. You can understand why it matters. How do I fix this? What other tools do I need? Some examples of what to do and what not to do. And again, if I don't want to click through item by item to understand, that list view and filtering will allow me to see a list of the issues that are a problem. So if I just, like Lori was saying, want to focus on a single issue, I can fix all the labels in my forms, or then I can move on to image alt text, and I can scope that work in a meaningful way. So I find efficiencies in there as well. Another thing that this does, let's see, is I think I'm going to switch over to the accessible version now, because when I'm doing these ad hoc tools, it's much better. So something I was also going to show off is that the intro, the Launchpad experience. So FastPass is what gets you to those accessible automated rules that you're going to check. And then there's the ad hoc tools. So once you click on the ad hoc tools, you'll be able to, again, to look under the hood. I've got landmarks on here, so I can see how this experience parallels the visual experience. Do I have everything kind of in a section so that the meaning and the layout are related to one another? I can do a similar thing for headings. So again, it's a toggle. I can turn that on and see where my headings are, and is content nested with one another? Is it related to one another? One other ad hoc tool is color. So if I turn off color on my experience, have I communicated color in a way that provides meaning, so that if somebody can't perceive this color, that they would be lost or unable to complete things the way somebody who can perceive color can? For example, in the form, in the inaccessible version, it says blue text is required and black text is optional. Well, if I can't perceive the difference between navy blue and black, which honestly, depending on the day, I can't, then I'm going to be lost, and I'm either stuck filling out the whole form or deciding like, maybe I don't want to do that. I'm going to abandon it. And finally, the last thing that I love about this is tab stops. So that's another toggle in the ad hoc tool. I can turn it on, and I can start to tab through my page and see where the reading order goes. Am I interacting with these tools in a way that makes sense with how I would read? So that way I'm getting instructions in the right order. And again, I understand how all of this content and information relates to one another. Okay, so that's the Accessibility Insights demo. We'll move on now to stress testing and talking about some color contrast. Okay, so the last test we're going to talk about is kind of doing some stress testing for experiences where people maybe zoom or adjust contrast. So in your browser, you can zoom in to see if content and functionality disappears, or maybe it's obscured. The ideal experience is that content reflows as you zoom in, so people don't have to scroll or pan in multiple directions to read and interact. So using responsive design here to reflow the experience to a single column, like up to 200% or 400% is really the ideal situation to align with the WCAG most recent guidance. But what that does is it creates a robust experience for a lot of different people. It adapts to your customers' needs. Some examples of things I've seen where maybe you do have responsive design, but the thought is like, oh, well, when it's one column and it's in this really small view, people are on a mobile device. And if they're on a mobile device, they don't need to print or they don't need to do this. And what you've done is you've removed functionality so that your customers who maybe have zoomed into the experience and are still on their desktop can't get to this functionality. Another common pitfall of this experience is that you've got text overlapping to where it really becomes unreadable, or it's truncated in a way that is really unreadable and they can't get the same meaning and interaction. Another principle in this to kind of stress test is for high contrast. It's an operating system setting. It allows people to adjust the view to kind of ease eye strain, help with light sensitivity. And it does that by adjusting the display of the interface to use a limited set of colors. So in Windows, This is done with ease of access settings. And high contrast mode has 4 preset options. You can test the experience by turning on the settings and making sure things like buttons don't disappear. Interactive controls are still there. And the text adjusts with colors and settings and they don't disappear. And one thing that I forgot to add to this, but I wanted to cover in this kind of stress testing idea is that you consider the importance of sound and audio in your design. If it is an essential part of the experience, there's video or there's meaning communicated through sound, make sure you've provided text alternatives, whether it's captions, audio descriptions, transcripts, something so that people who cannot perceive sound also get the same understanding out of it. So now back to Lori to kind of give us some more insight.
Great. Thanks, Jen, and thanks, Natalie. I think now you've followed these steps to identify some accessibility issues on your site. You know a little bit about more what's going on under the hood. And now you have a bunch of accessibility problems that you've identified in your first set of user flows or web pages. So now what? So on this slide, we have a picture of 2 intersecting circles, one labeled high user impact and the other labeled low effort to fix. As you might guess, the intersection of those 2 is a sweet spot where we'd like to find those issues that really are going to improve the user experience if we fix them and not be so hard to fix. And there are some of those. So we definitely do that. Of course, we need to kind of take a blended approach here because there's other issues to consider as well. We also have a chart here that's done, it's an output from a project that WebAIM has done that tests 1 million home pages on a regular basis to see what the common WCAG accessibility failures are. So we've included that data as well. And so on that, you'll see that low contrast or color contrast problems, missing alternative text, missing link text, and form field labels and empty buttons are amongst those top common problems. So putting this all together, we have a suggested list of the categories of improvements that you might want to focus on first. This is not, of course, a substitute for looking at all of the applicable WCAG criteria, but again, shrinking the change, reducing some overwhelm. This is a starting point of again, those impactful, but also not terribly difficult issues to address. So the first one is color contrast. This dramatically improves readability, helps everyone. So that's a great area. And usually that's, some styling adjustments that can be made. Missing form fields, missing labels for form fields is another one that's essential for people who use assistive technology like screen readers. Same thing applies for link text and alternative text for images. Big categories and relatively straightforward to fix those. And then we actually include page language because that's one of those really simple ones that will just simply let the screen reader, for example, know what language is this page using for the content. And then included on this list also, very important area like Natalie was talking about earlier is, can people operate this site with the keyboard alone? And that's so critical. It's very foundational in accessibility. It does take a bit longer sometimes, depending on the complexity of your little widgets and controls. A lot of the basics are fairly well understood. And the patterns, there's expected patterns that could be found in the ARIA specification. Hopefully we include that link as well. Yeah, I think we do. And so those would be kind of, again, a suggested list of how do you prioritize, what do you start tackling first? These would be our recommendations for that. So next slide. Okay, so now of course we get to where we'll kind of gently call the hard part, which is fixing the issues. And so obviously this is not necessarily just a piece of cake. And to that point, we have kind of a classic cartoon here, which is 2 gentlemen, scientists at a chalkboard with complex formulas on the first part, and then complex output on the last part, and then this big statement that a miracle occurs in the middle, with one suggesting that perhaps we need to be a little more explicit here. Well, so obviously the topic of how to fix all accessibility issues is rather deep for one slide, but we do have a great list of beginner resources included in this deck to send out that will kind of stage you through your learning journey in accessibility. And then the good news here, As accessibility is a practice, you get better at it over time. And that once you understand those patterns for solutions, you'll start to see, aha, we can just apply those over time. Then you can use tools like Accessibility Insights and others to kind of verify, oh, yep, okay, we got that fixed. And now we know how to do color contrast. And now we understand that we have to think about tab order and keyboard accessibility going forward. So any thoughts to add to that, Natalie?
Well, first I would say absolutely be sure to recognize that context is decisive. The WCAG guidelines are voluminous and it can become overwhelming. But really, you want to be mindful about your specific product, where the gotchas might be, and focus on that. You don't have to sort of boil the entire ocean more than you need to focus on the issues. And there's lots of resources. The guidelines and techniques themselves from the W3C body, but also resources like Twitter and Slack channels for accessibility professionals and websites and blogs and that sort of thing. So there's no dearth of support. Now we want to look at what are you to do? How do you ensure that you've gotten to the heart of the matter, that you have addressed the accessibility issues that you've found? Well, of course, the first thing you're going to do is you want to iterate through the steps that you just took to find the issues, to ensure that it's no longer possible to find them or that you've mitigated the problem. You want to make sure that you check your experience with a screen reader, and we'll talk a little bit more about that next. But last but absolutely not least, engage with people with disabilities to get more specific feedback about your user flows. And that can seem daunting at first, but there are organizations that will support you in identifying folks to test your product, but also it's good to start building a relationship with folks in the disability communities to provide feedback for you ongoingly, because you're always going to need it. Next, we'll talk a little bit about using a screen reader to verify. So as you can imagine, there are, you could create a test matrix with all of the various kinds of assistive technologies and browsers, and that can get daunting. But when you're just starting out, it's wise to have a small test matrix. And the recommended combinations include Chrome and NVDA on Windows, and Safari and VoiceOver on Mac. For mobile, those would be iOS VoiceOver on your iPhone, and TalkBack on Android. And what you're going to be looking through, what you're going to be listening for as you're reading through with the screen reader, is to ensure that there's access to all of the same functionality, meaning content that folks have visually. Want to make sure that there's consistency. You want to identify roadblocks in terms of navigation, ensure that's easy. And especially hidden elements or accidental craft in the code that shows up via the assistive technology. It's wise to learn a few basic commands for your preferred screen reader. You really want to think about going deep rather than broad when it comes to a screen reader. Find the screen reader that is most intuitive to you, or that's easiest for you to fire up, and get comfortable and familiar with that. Ideally, if possible, break up the work of learning to use an assistive technology among your colleagues. And of course, the best is to have native users of assistive technologies let you know what they're finding as they're navigating through your site.
And I wanted to point out one thing before we move on. A beginner mistake that I had made was assuming that I had to test with every single thing and know, across all of these different setups that something worked the same way. And the thing is that each assistive technology is nuanced, but the steps that we gave you before, those are agnostic. If you fix a label, if you add alt text, it doesn't matter what screen reader you use to validate that, it's going to be there. And it's going to be there for the customer in a way that they understand with their own verbosity settings and be there to help them navigate the way that they prefer to navigate.
Yeah, I agree, Jen. And one more tip maybe on that is that I always try to tell people learning a screen reader, figure out how to turn it off first and then figure out how to turn it on because it can get a little confusing once you get started. For example, like with VoiceOver on iOS, there's some shortcuts. You can just turn it off quickly so you don't get lost or stuck. All right, so Natalie and Jen and I drew straws on who would share an actual example from their actual real world. I got the short straw, so but kidding aside, it's time to give you an example from my current real world. We talked about accessibility as a journey and how the early stages can be a bit discouraging and alarming. So we have two short videos here to share. The first video is basically a before and after story. Fortunately, it's a good story. And the first before is on the NBC website to show how was a screen reader announcing the names of the TV shows that we offer at NBC and the images on the site. Spoiler alert, not good. And then the second video shows a much better and more accessible experience using a screen reader. And that you could pretty obvious. And I think one of the lessons to take away here, hopefully, is that, well, it's fairly obvious when a screen reader is working well with your site or not. So if we can go ahead and tee up the before example, go ahead with that.
Link. Clickable 200,515 416 9308 live cut down sh. Clickable 200,515 416 9307 live finale par. Unlabeled graphic S18 times 10 to the power of 18 05/19/20 graphic S18 times 10 to the power of 8.
So we'll pause there for just a moment. Unfortunately, I didn't caption this, but it would be very difficult to caption because essentially it was really reading out just gibberish, garbage text that really didn't help the user convey what it is that they're focusing on. So again, on that journey, progress has been made. So we can now see what it looks like now.
The Voice, cut down of live performances, season 19, episode 18, aired on 12/15/20 link. The Voice, live finale part 1, season 19, episode 17. The Voice, The Voice, The Voice, The Voice holiday celebration, season 19, episode 14, aired on 12/03/20 link.
So now it's correctly announcing the name of the show, the particular season and episode of that show, what date it was aired, and the short description of the show. So very equivalent experience to what's being displayed visually. This is the target that we go after for a usable experience. So there you have it. And now maybe over to Jen to talk about a few pitfalls that we will want you to avoid as you go.
And this is such a familiar story where you get in and you start digging in and you're just like, oh my God, how could I not know? Or how could this happen? And it really is an awful feeling. But once you feel it, once it gets better, the feeling of knowing that you're opening access to people is really one that you can't describe. Some other feelings along the way or some pitfalls to avoid that we wanted to cover that we've gone through or we've witnessed. I know in my early days of learning, one of these first things is I was the lone wolf. I was the only person. I was doing all the front end work. I had no tools, no budget, no know-how, no understanding. And I was technically the lone wolf in my office. But going back to what Natalie said before, there's an entire community of people online that are blogging about their experience, sharing techniques. So you really aren't alone. There's really amazing communities, again, on LinkedIn, on Twitter, more blogs and articles than I could count to help navigate this path forward. Another similar rabbit hole that I fell into was focusing on perfection, fixing everything for everyone all at once and holding up iterations of progress because I was worried it wasn't perfection. And again, because I didn't know what I didn't know, there were some gaps in that. And I think Lori and Natalie, you've faced similar things if you want to jump in and share those.
Absolutely. I added, overusing ARIA as a common pitfall. And there's an image here that shows the sort of a fight club group of folks. And it says the first rule of ARIA is don't use ARIA, which is a subtle nod to the using ARIA recommended draft of the W3C. Great and wise Steve Faulkner. It's just a funny way to think of it. It's so easy to think everything is a nail when you have a hammer, like the ARIA specifications, but it's a very, very powerful tool that should be used wisely and sparingly.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, we always favor where we can, think about those native HTML elements, those buttons, and they're still really good. They still work. So, so no need to kind of take a simple problem and create a complex fix, which is to some extent what ARIA kind of falls into. But I totally agree with these pitfalls. I also have experienced the lone wolf. I think that iterative approach, as with anything, we're just constantly making improvements. So let's just treat accessibility like that. It's not an other thing. It's a quality measure on some level. We keep improving the quality. We keep pushing for better experiences. So absolutely, agree with all of these.
Yeah, and I think people tend to think of accessibility as a one and done. You start here, you go here, it's a straight line, and you're good. You've nailed it. But your site is changing all the time. Everything is changing all the time. Browsers, AT, like all of the different tools and platforms that we're using. So accessibility really is part of that agile process. It's circular. You get to the end, you get customer feedback, and you start to iterate again, and you learn, and you get better, and you mature as you grow. So this isn't a one and done straight line, it's a circle. With that, we'll go into some of the summary of resources that we've got here. Some, again, beginner things that we've talked about in the slide. There's some short videos about learning accessibility if you prefer to learn by video. There's the Accessibility Insights tool, understanding how to use ARIA, what is web accessibility, a free course on web accessibility for devs, understanding, again, that accessibility object model. That might be phase 3 or 4, but again, getting that picture of how everything works together. The shortcuts that Natalie provided for the screen readers, for VoiceOver and NVDA, and then a WebAIM article that covers keyboard accessibility, like how do I trigger a button, or how am I supposed to interact with radio controls? Those are important to understand. And finally, to wrap it up, we've got our Twitter profiles. Again, we're a community of people. There's a lot of people on Twitter that are available, LinkedIn, etc. So for Lori, it's at Lori, Lori, Samuels, Samuels 18. Natalie is at Natalie Patrice T, and that's Natalie Patrice T. And then I am Jenny Ann Lynn, JenniAynnLynn. So find us on Twitter. Become part of the community. You really do have the power here to do and make these changes. I know we're all kind of stuck and feeling frustrated being stuck at home, but I think we all lose sight of the incremental power of change and that we can all do this together. Anything that you all wanted to add before we close out?
No, I think I'm just excited for folks at the beginning of their journey. I know and recall how daunting it can be. And I'm really excited for folks as they begin and sort of begin to learn and find their way to us in the community.
Yeah, I completely agree. I've seen, I mean, gosh, in the time that I've been doing accessibility, it's grown so much as a practice. The community has, one thing that hasn't changed is just how incredibly supportive and wonderful this community of practice is. You just post a question on Slack and accessibility and, 20 people immediately try to answer and help you out. So that's one of the things that I really love about this space is just the support and community that we have. So welcome if you're new, and we're happy to have you here. And we hope that this has been helpful for a few tips to get started.